Hey, Cyberview community, we are back. Your host for today's episode, as always, are Frida, Carlos, and myself. And today's topic is Internet of Things. Cool, smart devices that we all on daily basis, well, most of us use. Could be smart watches, could be your vacuum cleaners at home, smart TVs, etc., etc. But there's always a big question around, are those devices speaking into our lives? So let's dive deeper into that particular topic and talk about safety of those devices and safety of our own privacy when using those devices. Probably the best thing to start with, I would say, is identifying what is Internet of Things, what are those devices, and especially why there's this huge concern around security of those devices. Carlos, maybe you could get us started on this. I know you know quite a bit about this topic.
Sure. I mean, by definition, IoT or Internet of Things is practically any type of device that without any interaction with the user, it's able to connect into the internet and do multiple things. Like, for example, something as simple as Wi-Fi enabled light bulb, which you can turn on and off your light bulbs from your office, or something as complicated as, for example, in the industry, you have stuff like temperature meters that are going into, for example, metal melting furnaces that will tell you if it's okay to take out the metal or not. The problem with this, and especially talking about security, is that by definition, by architecture, IoT is not secure. So out of the box, anything that is IoT, that is internet enabled, is not going to be secure. That's the job of the end user. And that's one of the biggest problems. You need to be very network savvy in order to be able to secure your network. And that's on one side. On the other hand, you are not the owner of the code that is running inside of these devices. So in most cases, these devices are running some specific firmware that comes from the provider. You could talk about, for example, Hikvision cameras. You can talk about Nest safe cameras as well, safety cameras as well, or Alexa, Google Assistants. You don't know what is running inside. You don't know what could be the things that might be unsecure on the code side of things. And on the network side of things, in order to make something extremely secure, for example, you will need to create your internal network that is not exposed to the internet, that has a tunnel that is going into an intermediate service, and then from there to your client device. So it's very complicated, and most end users are not going to bother with that. But of course, they will be looking for the convenience of having IoT devices. And that's one of the biggest issues, and that's also one of the biggest trends that we have right now. We have a lot of IoT devices, Internet of Things devices that are going into the market, and a lot of people are not aware of the risk of them. So, I mean, I used to work with IoT devices back in the day, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. We never trust anything that comes from a provider. We build our own stuff. And that's the only way that you can actually make sure that you are doing a good job on the cybersecurity side. But for example, for the end user perspective and the system administrator perspective, I don't know, Frida, you have any insights of what is to install these things that you will get, for example, I don't know, from your CTO, from your systems manager, and say, hey, here are these 100 IoT devices installed and put them in the network. How is it from the system administrator perspective?
It's a little complex, because from the end user perspective, they're like, oh, great, I have this beverage machine that I really wanted. And it saves the environment in a way. There's many good things about it. You're not using as many plastic water bottles, and you have flavored drinks. It's good for employee morale. However, it's always connected to the internet, right? And so as IT, and especially IT security, we're looking at devices like that because they can be used as tunnels to attack the entire network then, which is one of the curious things about IoT devices. Like, I love this topic because they're always connected to the internet usually. And exactly, Carlos, like the things you named to go through to keep yourself secure are really complex for the average user. And even to us, I think it's a few steps to get, if we were to have multiple devices like that, right? It's a very diverse and fragmented ecosystem. So I've noticed, just like AI has become really popular and there's this huge race for everyone has AI now, right? It's kind of the same with IoT devices. It's like everything needs to be connected to the internet. And I know that's the very definition of them, but for some things, I find, in my opinion, to be unnecessary, but also putting yourself in the way of, I guess, really unnecessary risk in some instances. So, for instance, you mentioned cameras, and a lot of times people do not change the default credentials on cameras. And I hate to say this, but it's fairly easy to look up these devices, to look up people's cameras, and you log in with the default login. You don't even have to be a hacker. You can just see anyone who has their camera up, which is quite a few people. And we're talking inside your home. You've kids, like all this kind of stuff. So it's really fascinating from a security perspective, like how to manage these devices that don't have regular updates or regulation per se from like a unified company with security standards.
I would say that's where the contradiction comes in, right? In terms of the whole purpose why everyday user like myself, for instance, especially the users aren't necessarily working in tech industry or cybersecurity industry. Normally you get devices as such for convenience of things, right? So you get a smart TV, you get vacuum cleaner, you get smart fridge, whatever it's going to be. And the convenience of thing is going to be how simple it is to use it, right? How open it is, accessible, and so on. But then the security side of things on Internet of Things devices, it's going to be a lot more complicated. So obviously, as Carlos, as you said, for instance, to set up that internal network that where you would have a tunnel to the internet network itself, it's actually very complicated for an average individual like myself. I wouldn't be able to just go off and set it up immediately. And actually, I do work in cybersecurity industry, so even with that, it will take some effort. So let alone for a random individual, that's probably not very achievable easily. And it goes against the whole purpose why we get devices as such. And I think it's interesting, probably maybe just to outline as well, the big purpose why we're actually talking about this topic now is that we saw from a research that the malware in Internet of Things devices have increased by 400% 2023 compared to 2022. So obviously, it's a huge topic, and we can see that the trend, it'll probably keep on going up, because looking at the numbers, even looking at the numbers 2018 compared to 2023, in terms of how many cyber attacks amounted in IoT, it gone up from 32 million in 2018 to 112 million in 2023. So that's quadrupled. It's a scary number. And the trends, what do you think, guys? Obviously it'll continue going up, but how do we at least educate the users to make sure it's protecting?
Well, I think this type of data, we need to take it with a grain of salt, because as well, it's it has gone 4 times the amount of attacks in a year or in the amount of years, but also at the same time, we don't know how many devices are also there as well. I don't know. Maybe it's 10 times more devices and only 4 times more the attacks. It means that newer devices are safer, or maybe not. So we need to also look on the other side as well. And also regarding educating the people. The situation here is that, as we were discussing before, it's complicated. And on my case, for example, I try to avoid having IoT devices, mainly because it's very cumbersome. Even for me that I know how to do it, will take me a whole day to install one single camera. So it's like, it's not worth it.
Yeah. Frida, do you use any IoT devices at home?
I don't. I'm in the camp of being a somewhat paranoid IT person. And you might find there's two types of IT people. The type that is really into emerging technologies and anything smart and, just any smart device, connect everything, like automate everything. Your life streamlines, you wake up in the morning and you get the weather and like all this kind of stuff. I am of the other camp where I try to have the least amount of technology as possible, which might be surprising for what I do. However, we're here. I'm here to help educate people about technology more so than interested in the technology itself. So,
Frida, it's interesting because because I was going to say I'm sort of in the middle. So I think there's a third group where I love emerging technology, but I think being in the middle is even worse because if you don't really immerse yourself into new technology due to safety concerns of some sort, it's easy you protecting yourself. Or if you really immerse yourself, you are fully exposed. For me, I'm actually in the middle where I love the new device coming out, but then I'm aware of security concerns and risks, and therefore, I try to implement some devices and then avoid some other devices. And for instance, probably one of the big devices that a lot of people, especially here in the US, use is Amazon's Alexa. Yeah. I used to have one in my office before, just for the convenience of things. And obviously, I never dared to use that at home in my personal space. And that's probably, we can move into another topic in terms of real life cases, right? So obviously, Alexa is very popular. And Alexa had some safety concerns as well around users' data being accessible, because I think the whole purpose behind using a tool like Alexa is, like Frida, like you mentioned, to get that. You wake up in the morning, you get the news, you get the weather forecast updates, you can ask to turn on the music, you name it. But where does that information come from, and how is that information is being used, especially with a device that is always on? And obviously, I don't know, you guys, maybe Carlos, you want to jump into Alexa's potential issues or privacy concerns?
Yeah, the thing here with Alexa, at least, is that it's always not only it's always on, it's always listening. Even if you don't say, "Hey Alexa, do Siri, do this or do that," it's always there. All those things that people say, like, "Oh, that's so weird. I was talking with my wife about vacations in Bali, and suddenly I got some ads about it." So weird.
You've always been
weird.
there.
It's just Alexa listening to you.
That's the thing. How many times, like for instance, we don't even need to talk about IoT devices. We could talk about mobile phones that are always listening as well, right? So how many times that you had it happen where randomly on iPhone, Siri just says something, right? Because it's always listening. So those type of things, we laugh it off, but it's just outlining the actually safety concern and privacy concern itself. And IoT devices it's a lot worse than mobile phone, and the protection of it is actually a lot harder. And okay, so I would say let's move to the actual security itself. So how do we make sure that those type of devices are fully protected? And US is actually releasing Cyber Trust Mark. So it's going to be set by Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and they're proposing to have a program to raise the bar for actual security across the smart devices. And what they're introducing Cyber Trust Mark. And basically what that means, that every device that passed the security measures set by the FCC, the device will have a shield logo. So predominantly what they're making it easier for consumers to understand which devices have gone through that minimum security measures and actually has the increased cybersecurity when using the IoT device. Thoughts on this?
The reality is that when you're creating a product, especially this type of products based on hardware, securing stuff and taking all the precautions in order to have this shield, this badge, is costly. So this will translate into cost to the end user. So if you have for example, I don't know, Amazon Alexa or a Nest or a Ring camera that has the badge, and you have a knockoff that is half the price, but they do the same functionality. The only difference is that one of them has a shield and the other one has not. That's not going to be able to tackle this issue on the long term, because only the people that can afford security will have security, and the ones that can't will still be vulnerable. And that's a very big issue.
So in a way, I'd say, Frida, sorry, I'll pass it on to you, but I just gonna, to me, like first example that popped in my head, might be a bad example, but probably like organic, right? So for instance, in the US as well, you have fresh produce, for instance, and some will be marked organic, some will be non-organic. And organic, a lot of times you'll be paying premium that could be double or triple the price. And there's only probably going to be the select few that would actually go for organic produce and pay that premium price. So probably here, what Carlos, you suggesting that might be relatively similar circumstance, right? Yeah,
because it's not a ban on non-badge stuff. It's just
absolutely.
If you want to have the badge on your product, just do what you need to do. If not, you can still sell your product and it's still fine. So,
Frida, are you as skeptical?
Yes. On the more, to be as positive as possible about this, I would say the potential is very awesome. I think it's something that, first of all, will take probably a very long time to implement. And then once it's implemented, it'll probably take a really long time for other companies to follow suit and be like, because in reality, all companies should try and strive to be this way, right? But as Carlos mentioned, that is the largest thing I'm skeptical about, is that, yes, it's now you're going to have to pay for higher security. And there is an assumption that, consumers will be very willing to do that just based off the fact that it's more secure and it has this label. I wish that were the case. There's just the price is a huge factor against it. And then the fact that, it's as much as we would like every single consumer and end user to have security as their largest priority, it generally isn't, which also makes sense, right? Because they're not buying a product to be secure. They're buying a product to control the lights or whatever,
And moving on to Europe's approach to that, it's slightly different, a lot more aggressive. So EU is releasing Cyber Resilience Act that's coming out this year in 2024. And the approach itself is going to be slightly different, or so to say, a lot different. So in terms of recommendation with the US, with the mark, Europe is actually going to be imposing fines and cybersecurity requirements as well for companies that do not apply the Cyber Resilience Act itself. So it's going to introduce a mandatory cybersecurity requirement for all hardware and software that's being sold in European Union. That would be ranging from baby monitors, watches, pretty much all smart devices, and go to even firewall devices and so on. And like I mentioned, it's going to be mandatory, and it's going to create a massive burden on manufacturers to comply with Cyber Resilience Act or drop out of the market if you don't comply, and then you wouldn't be able to sell in European Union. So what are your thoughts on Cyber Resilience Act? Absolutely different approach to the US with actual cyber trust mark. But Frida, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I'm positive. I want to start out positive, right? If it's good, as my opinion, as much privacy as possible is really good. And if we're starting to implement this compliance, and other companies will have to follow suit. Manufacturers also face a lot of pressure with this, right? Because they can face fines of up to 15 million pounds or 2.5% of their total worldwide annual turnover. So if they do not comply and they don't, take these essential cybersecurity requirements seriously under the Cyber Resilience Act, I think they'll get into, quite a lot of trouble. So that's great. I do wonder, again, as Carlos hit on earlier, this again is a huge financial burden on the company, and it's still putting the onus on the end user, I think, to be secure ultimately. So again, it doesn't change the fact that people don't update their passwords regularly, or they don't change them, or they'll use the same password across the board, or they don't have MFA enforced. If these things are successfully enforced or made easier for the end user, I think that's great. But like we hit on earlier too, I think it'll take quite a lot of time to get it together,
Yeah, and on the other hand, again, I don't like to be this guy, but I'm also skeptic on this. The problem here is that we can compare it with the automotive industry. They have regulations. For example, they need to put seat belts on the cars, but it's up to the end user to use the seat belt. You can just not use it, and it's up to you. They provide you with the security tools. It's up to you if you use them or not. Exactly. And the law says that you need to go and respect certain speed limit. You can decide not to respect it. Of course, there's going to be fine, as we were discussing, but after a fine, you can continue. And it's if you don't get caught, you can do it and no one will tell you anything. And with the IoT and cyber resilience situation as well, is that the problem here is that vendors will make everything that they can in order to provide you with the security tools that you need to use as end user. But if the end user doesn't know, for example, the basics of networking, the basics of creating a tunnel, the basics of securing a network, the tools are going to be there. They just don't understand what a CIDR is. They just don't understand what a subnet is, what a subnet mask is. So it's going to be also very hard for the end user to use the tools that are provided to them. And that's one of my biggest fears, that perhaps for the companies, they're going to start shipping secure things or things that have secure capabilities. But if we don't educate the end user, it's going to end up in the same situation in which, as you were mentioning, Frida, they're using the same passwords. The network is not secure. It's exposed to the internet. Yeah, it's super secure, architecturally speaking, your camera, but it's exposed to the internet because you didn't configure correctly the network. So it comes all down to education. And the sad thing here is that it's not an easy feat to do. It's kind of complicated terms and kind of complicated method, terminology and architecture, infrastructure that not a lot of people will go deep into.
For real. I've spent, I would say, as I mentioned earlier, my career, I think IT people, I always think this, will have to step up even more to help the average, customer educate themselves on these things you mentioned. Even though, it's a huge challenge because they are really complex concepts and things to do. Especially when you consider that most people struggle even with the concept of a password manager and how to use that. Which is totally fair, by the way. There's UI and weird stuff going on with many different password managers. But the back end is not pretty. These things we're talking about don't have UI. So
100%. I think great examples, both Carlos and Frida here. And of course, there needs to be minimum security measures set. And I think that's where, especially with US Cyber Trust Mark as well, is going into the right direction. Carlos, as you mentioned, with automotive industry itself, the example there is that at least the cars now have seatbelts, and it's up to the actual driver of the car and passengers to be aware of the security risk right? The horror stories. What happens if you don't put the seatbelt on? So I think we're heading the right direction to make sure that we have that laid foundation to make sure that minimum security measures at least are implemented into the device. And I think, Frida, when you mentioned that security people need to be educating the users better, I would say it's not the security people. I would say it's the manufacturers, right? Where the security measures need to be set fully first, which, I mean, we saw with Amazon Rings leak itself with data, right? They implemented mandatory two-factor authentication, which is a great start. That has to be there at least. Then CyberTrust implementing at least the safe first password set. So when you buy the device, at least the password set by the device is going to be unique. We're going to be at least somewhat safe. So it's not going to be something as simple as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then I would say the vendor itself that provides the tool, it needs to be able to provide some sort of education around it, maybe a brochure, maybe just outlining the issues or what the steps, how to set up a device. And when you're setting a device, there needs to be one of the steps saying log in, change the password, or how to maybe create even internal network itself, right? Closed off network. But I think it's heading the right direction. But absolutely, we need to make sure what to do. Firstly, how to protect the devices. We mentioned 2FA, multi-factor authentication, so two-factor authentication to be set when you buy a device as such. Network, that's obviously a tougher topic where it's going to be a lot more complicated because we just tend to connect to our internet and that's it. But the weak precautions that we don't really have now, we need to be aware. So yeah, password change. As soon as you implement the device, make sure you implement two-factor authentication as well when you buy the new device.
Right on. Let's hope that these regulations do push the manufacturer to do the right thing there, because you're right on it. It should be on them.
As always, thank you for tuning into the Cyberview episodes. Make sure you give it a listen, watch the other episodes if you haven't, but see you soon.